Welcome to the Conservative Caucus podcast. This is Jim Pfaff, president of the Conservative Caucus. Wanted to just thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a discussion with my friend, Colin Elliott. Colin Elliott is a professor of history at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. He's a very close personal friend of mine. He's an expert in Roman history. He also hosts the Pax Romana podcast. It's a weekly podcast about the Roman Empire, and that's Pax Romana. But he's also the author of a recent book, Pax Romana, the Plague that shook the Roman world. And it was published with Princeton University Press in 2024. And also Economic Theory and the Roman Monetary Economy, published out of Cambridge in 2020. As I say, he's a PhD professor at Indiana University in the history department. We're having a discussion in this podcast about how did ancient governments in the classical period of Rome, how did they deal with things like charity? Did they have systems of welfare programs? How did that work? If it did happen, I'm talking about this subject because we're in a stage right now where there are many efforts, particularly by the Trump administration, to remove many programs that are really expensive in the federal government. But we've got this idea in this day and age about what welfare ought to be, what we think it ought to be. And you're going to find out from an expert in the field that what we think of welfare programs is really a modern construct. There's very little in the ancient world, really in the 2,000 years since the Christian church was founded, that there really ever was much of what we call welfare. And there's a lot of discussion in the progressive Christian movement to say that it is really sinful for Donald Trump, for example, to get rid of USAID funding. And that's just absolutely theologically false. It's historically inaccurate to try to say that even Christian thinking in the early church, where charity was really a big part of what the church did at that time through the Antonine Plague, as Colin studied closely, but also through other major situations in those first 300-400 years of the church, you did not find any idea of secular government doing welfare. And you found no actual command in church doctrine about doing welfare. Now, Colin's expertise is in Roman history and Roman culture. So what we're talking about is dealing specifically with how did that work in secular governments at the time, or I should say non-Christian governments. But this is a good background to try to understand and put some meat on what were Christians thinking at the time in the early church as it relates to what secular government did and what they thought were the best means of charity at the time. And I maintain that we need to, as best possible and politically possible, eliminate charity programs in the government. Really, at any level would be best, because government always messes these things up. Whereas the church has been the most effective welfare, social need tool that there ever was. And the West has done that the best. So I wanted to get that background from someone who really understands how these things work. And Colin Elliott is the guy. So we're going to roll into that. And by the way, go to theconservativecaucus.com to find out more about the Conservative Caucus and get more information. I'll pick up on that at the end of the podcast. So here with my friend Colin Elliott, professor of history at Indiana University. Well, welcome everyone to the Conservative Caucus podcast. I'm really excited about today because I get to talk with actually a really dear and close friend, Colin Elliott. He's a professor in the classics department at Indiana University. PhD with an emphasis in Roman history. He's actually a Roman history expert, but he really understands how this connects in. He makes good connections into what's happening in contemporary government and politics around the world because, and he proved it recently by writing a book called Pax Romana, it deals with the Antonine Plague. If you know Roman history, the Antonine Plague happened mostly during Marcus Aurelius's imperial rule in Rome. And actually, you did a great job, Colin, kind of getting into a contemporary issue there because we had just gone through, or were going through actually when you were writing it, the COVID thing. I'm guessing you were probably thinking about writing this book prior to COVID coming out, or at least thinking through it as a big, major event in Roman history. But then it just kind of dovetailed perfectly into what was happening. And I'm sure that in your planning for the book that you weren't thinking of anything like COVID, but then suddenly bang, there's a real connection there. So that's one way that you kind of have recently, at least, connected into modern history and how we learn those lessons from Rome. But in fact, let's just start with that. So tell me about how you originally conceived the book and the shocking story about how it became so relevant quickly thereafter.
Yeah. It's kind of funny how all those things sort of work together. So initially I was working out some kind of book that would deal with this pandemic, the Antonine Plague, which, as you rightly said, struck Rome under the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So this is happening in around 160 AD. And this disease was a mystery, like nobody really was able to diagnose it well. Historians have been a little bit puzzled as to how bad it was, with some historians saying it was really bad, like, killing 30% of the population bad. And then there were other historians that are kind of like, nah, this is probably mostly made up. Like the Roman writers that wrote about it were just mad about some other things. And they just were trying to say that there was a really bad disease and kind of blame it on the current leadership. And so, I had been doing research on this disease and its economic impacts for about 5 years. And then once March 2020 hit, suddenly people became very interested in pandemics, and I had a publisher reach out to
a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that's what happened. So a publisher reached out to me because I've known somebody that had written some books for this publisher and just said, "Hey, we heard about your work. Do you have a book idea or anything like that about a disease? We think that people might be interested in pandemics for a little bit." Nobody had any idea how bad, how like long lasting the whole COVID phenomenon was going to be. So I pitched them a book and I just said, look, you have to understand, like I would write the book the way that I want to write it. It needs to be, I'm not interested in I wasn't explicitly interested in making contemporary parallels, but then as COVID, and when I say COVID, I don't necessarily mean as much the disease as the kind of broader social and political and economic phenomenon. But as COVID kind of drug on, and I'm writing this book, going through that pandemic and like all of the fear and the anxiety and the scapegoating and, what is science and what does it mean to love your neighbor? And there were just all sorts of things that were in the air for several years. As all that was happening, it just caused me to look at the Antonine Plague, this historical pandemic, really differently. Like suddenly it's like, okay, was there more than just a disease going on in the Roman Empire? How anxious were people? Because this was the first time, Jim, that anybody had encountered a disease that could be anywhere, that could strike anybody. Typically, diseases in the ancient world were pretty local, or at least were sort of experienced in a local way. And this was the first time where Roman elites are like, we can't just leave the city of Rome for the summer and escape this thing.
Right.
This thing is following people, and it was terrifying. And they had obviously no concept for how to deal with this disease. And so as I'm writing this book, I just could not help but see parallels. And the referees, because this is a peer-reviewed book, and the editor were very good at trying to make this a timeless book so you could read it. It's not about COVID. It's not about our experience of COVID, but there are definitely some, you can tell when you read the book that, there are just these little hints that, there are definitely some parallels to the way that we went through our experience of a pandemic and the way that the Romans did. I use cheeky language in there sometimes, like I talk about, people not having religious exemptions to the mitigation measures in Rome, which that's a huge deal in the book is how religion became such at the forefront of the pandemic response in ancient Rome, because for the Romans, diseases were religious. They're caused by gods being furious with population. And so you have this group of Christians, about 10 to 40,000 people in the Roman Empire, that aren't participating in all of the sacrifices and the statue building and the rituals that are supposed to ward off this pandemic. And as a result, the Roman society, Roman elites, Roman mobs are getting furious with these non-compliant Christians. And again, you couldn't help but see some parallels with what was going on in the present.
Yeah, and it is interesting historically to always remember that modern forms of atheism, for example, and radical secular materialist atheism, I mean, there have been times where people have expressed that throughout history, but that's really mostly a modern phenomenon. Everyone in the ancient world, almost everyone, I mean, I'm not going to say everyone, but almost everyone in the ancient world really saw everything through a lens of religion. I mean, even though Socrates and Plato and Aristotle somewhat eschewed the idea of the gods and that sort of thing, from a philosophical perspective, they still had this adherence. I mean, when you're reading Plato's dialogues, it's a constant discussion of how do the gods think about this. And so Socrates comes back and pushes, against the gods in a way, but never in such a way as to throw the shackles off, so to speak.
Right. I mean, even Socrates believes and justifies himself by saying he's doing the work of the gods. The gods have given him a sort of calling to go out and engage with the craftsmen and the philosophers and all these people in Athens who think that they are knowledgeable. And Socrates has this mission from the gods to kind of examine them. And he really sees himself as being a public servant in many respects in service to the gods. And you're exactly right. Even someone like Cicero in the Roman Empire or in the Roman Republic, he has some what we might call atheistic ideas, and that he's not really sure like what's going on up there in the sky, but Cicero would never dream of not performing the religious rituals and the sacrifices. And so you're exactly right. Even for Romans, and many people in the Roman world, belief in the gods is just kind of, it's all just kind of guesswork. Like who knows who the gods are and what they're doing. And they have all these different stories and myths. And in one myth, Zeus is doing this, and another myth, he's doing the opposite thing. And really the point is, no, we just need to keep doing these rituals because we don't know how the gods, what their names all are and maybe all of that. But we understand that when we do particular rituals, the results are either good or bad. And so we want to make sure that we do those things. And that, by the way, is what Christians, that's what got Christians on sort of the bad side of so many Romans, because their view's totally different. For Christians, it's all about belief. So God needs to be known. His son Jesus needs to be known. We need to have very precise details about the relationship between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. All of that needs to be really well articulated. And the Roman public rituals are not only something that shouldn't be participated in, but they are blasphemous, right? These are things that are totally incompatible with Christianity. So this just creates huge tension, by the way, between Christians and Romans, huge source of tension.
It's really interesting when you pop into the modern age here. The interaction during COVID was against radical materialistic, atheistic secularism and Christianity for the most part. I mean, in other countries, other religions, Islam's still very large. In India, it's, homo religioso like crazy. But when you look in Western society during COVID, that tension was against a radical godless secularism and a Christian, Jewish, mostly belief system. And then you see these tensions coming in here in a little bit different way, but it's still kind of similar. It actually in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, I think the structure of the Roman gods wasn't only a personal belief system or a personal connection to those ideas, but the state institutionalized that. And from that base and from that ideological perspective is how they mitigated a lot of this when it came to Roman society in general.
So especially in the imperial period, when you get emperors putting themselves in kind of the pinnacle of Roman religion, emperors function as almost messianic or like high priest like figures. So the first Roman emperor, Augustus, he kind of views himself and sets himself up as an intermediary between Romans who have gone astray and caused all these civil wars and the end of the Republic and all of this. And Augustus is now the kind of, the son of the god. He's the son of the divine Julius Caesar. And there's like this divine essence in him. And so it's sort of up to him to perform the right sort of public sacrifices for the entire population. Hymns are written about him doing this by authors like Horace, and each Roman emperor from then on out has this kind of mandate to enforce religious piety and devotion. And we see this to varying degrees depending on which emperor. And again, some of them are very self-serving in the way that they do this. Like, Caligula loses a daughter, if I remember correctly. And he demands that everybody mourn this daughter as divine, and nobody's allowed to even spend time with their family because that would just be anathema. And so he prescribes all of these rituals that one's supposed to do. They're very sort of kind of so focused on him and his own mourning. He doesn't want anybody else to be happy. So you got things like that. But then you also have emperors like Elagabalus, who rules in the early 3rd century AD. He worships a rock. He worships a meteorite that he brings from Syria. He sets it up in Rome and builds a giant temple and makes everybody worship this rock and has all these very bizarre ways of worshiping the rock. And again, just sort of institutes that, expects that to be adhered to and followed. So yeah, in Roman society, you have this mix of a very kind of higgledy-piggledy hodgepodge of religious ideas. And then at the same time, you have a strong imperial center demanding that everybody engage in particular forms of piety as well, because the idea is the state needs to be covered. We don't know exactly who the gods are and all of that, but we do know that if we're all worshiping the gods and making sure to do the rituals that work, then we'll be okay. We'll be safe. And this is one of the things that starts to break down in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, because things begin to go very wrong for the Roman Empire, and Christians are right in the crosshairs because they're not doing any of these rituals.
Just another twist on this. Do you see what you just described, which again shows up in various ways amongst the emperors? And most of this shows up in imperial Rome. Like the Republic wasn't so, I mean, there certainly would have been some attempts to require certain ritualistic and or, appropriate connections to the government in a way, but it wasn't quite the same as in imperial Rome, where the sense of the emperor being connected to the gods or a god, him or himself. Mm-hmm. But do you see some parallels to that, and how these radical secularist governments of this day require certain sorts of obeisance to the dogma that get laid out politically in our current environment in the West?
So, I mean, this is my own personal view, but one thing that I've just observed in life is that even people that claim that they have no religion worship something. And in the absence of organized religion, and I'm a Christian, and I find so much sense and meaning and really like logic in Christianity and Christian theology. But what's funny to me is I see all sorts of people, and I know all sorts of people, and many people that are my friends who I think of Christianity as something bizarre or strange or kind of unscientific or whatever. And at the same time, I mean, there are yard signs throughout the town that I live in, which say, in this house we believe, and then there's this list of things: Black Lives Matter, I don't know, water is life, so on and so forth, these sort of slogans. And it's like, do you realize that's a creed? Like,
yeah, exactly.
That's a statement of belief in the exact same way that the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed is a statement of belief. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think religion is inescapable. I think we're wired that way. An atheist that would claim that person, that he or she knows for sure that there's no God. I mean, where were you at the foundations of the world? How could you possibly know that?
Right.
You have to engage in some degree of belief. You weren't at the Big Bang. Right. And I doubt even the person that knows the most about, I say this as an expert in something. The more I became an expert in Roman history, the more I knew that I understood very little about it. Just go back to Socrates. The more I've learned about something very detailed and specific, the more I've realized I do not know things. Like my understanding of the world of knowledge has grown, like that exists, has grown way more than my actual knowledge. And so to accept so many things, you have to accept it on faith. And in the modern world, I think there are a lot of people that don't realize that they're doing that. And so they trust in experts. And instead of treating experts as fallible human beings, they treat them as priests. In some cases. And again, we saw that in some ways during the scientism that arose under COVID, where if an official made some statement that, when you walk into a restaurant, you need to wear a mask to your table, and then when you get to the table, you can take off your mask between bites, or you can take off. It's like, okay, so you're trying to tell me that a disease is afraid of tables. So as when you're walking through the restaurant, you have to be real careful because the disease can get you there. But then when you're at the table eating closely with everybody, suddenly the disease doesn't care. Or like when you're on an airplane, you have to wear a mask all the way through the airport and so on and so forth. But then, and in the airplane, you better keep that mask on. But then when we have peanuts for 5 minutes, then you can take the mask off because the disease is afraid of peanuts. I mean, this was ridiculous on its face, and it was totally irrational and totally unreasonable. And yet there were people that and again, I'm not trying to criticize people because the messaging was really heavy. But my point is that was a religious experience in many ways, what we went through during COVID. It was scientism.
It really was. And in fact, people who secularist, materialist will mock Christianity for its creeds, except that they have no idea what the etymology of the word creed is. It's from the Latin credo, which means I believe.
Yeah.
When you're expressing an I believe, like secularist, humanist, anti-religious people in Bloomington, Indiana, where you live, which I see the same thing. It's a pretty radical leftist town for the most part. A lot of people aren't, but for the most part. And they put that sign in the yard. I believe this. I believe I just want to reemphasize that they are expressing a creed. That is their secularist creed. This is their belief system. And it is around these things. And, but to the point of being an expert, like you can understand personally, I think, like you and I talk about Roman history quite a bit when we're personally talking. I would never claim myself to be an expert. I think I'm more well studied than the average bear on it, but I'm far from an expert. But when you're talking to people about that, if they have interest in hearing it, there can be a sense for you personally where when you're expressing the fact that, yeah, the more I know, the less I know.
Right.
Well, but for them, the more you know, the more awe-inspiring that is that you maintain all this information that began with a massive amount of work getting a PhD and hereafter for some years being a professor and still doing, having to do the publish approach and research approach. For them, that's like awe-inspiring. And it's the same with doctor. I remember my mom, who was a nurse. She studied to be a nurse. She decided not to be a nurse after a while. But she would always tell me stories about being a nurse and that these doctors would act like they were gods, and it just drove her nuts. Yeah. And she would catch them on stuff, and they wouldn't want to. This was in the 1960s, by the way, where you probably had a bit more looking down on women sort of thing in certain kinds of work. And certainly in the field of doctors, you had very few female doctors, but she's calling them out because she sees where they were wrong on something. In fact, I remember growing up with doctors we had for us as kids, she'd drive them nuts, but it's because she would check into it and then find them wrong. And then they would have to admit it, and they hated it, and they kind of disliked her and appreciated her, kind of combination of both things. But the point is that experts do get this sense because they do know so much more in their particular field than others. They can get that sense, that selfish sense of Godhead when they can confront someone on knowledge they have that the other people aren't as well studied at. And I've always taken the point where, I've tried to be logically consistent in everything that I look into. And you find so much illogical, really crappy illogical stuff from PhDs around the world. And I think we saw that coming together to a head in the COVID and actually prior to that with the climate change stuff. I mean, I think we've been seeing this in Western culture arise quite a bit. Yeah.
I don't know if you saw, Jim, that video. I think it was yesterday or the day before of Chris Cuomo just sort of saying, hey, I'm wrong about, and I appreciate that kind of thing. And I have to say, the only reason I know anything is because I've had to admit that I'm wrong about what I thought I knew. And I need to get a lot better at this. I mean, there are ways in which I'm still proud and which I want to be right and all that. I mean, I know we all struggle with that. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. But man, I learn so much more when I'm willing to just tell somebody, hey, I don't know this, and I need help understanding this. And I'm always in awe of people that have gained a lot of expertise in something. I was buying a car from a guy the other day, and his first kind of thing that he did in life was architecture. And he was just telling me about designing buildings. And I just thought man, this is amazing that this guy knows how to do all of this. Or, I'll have people, I can do a little bit on my car, but people that know I was watching mechanics on YouTube the other day, and these guys just know so much about everything that's going on in a car. Any noise that they hear, they know what it is. And that it's just totally amazing to me. And, it's neat to be an expert in something, but at the same time, I think expertise helps you realize how little that's the healthy response to learning a lot about something is actually projecting that out and realizing, okay, I've become an expert in something. I know a lot about this compared to most, compared to 99% of the people in the world. And yet I still don't know a lot. So what that means is when somebody's telling me something about their area of expertise, yep, they know a lot about that thing. But at the same time, there's a lot that they don't know. And there's sort of a humility that came with having to learn that expertise. And I think we kind of intuitively understand that in situations like you describe, where we see an arrogant person who's trying to use knowledge as a weapon to put somebody down or to suggest that they know. We can see that right away, because I think intuitively we know that anything that we've really learned well, we had to learn through a lot of struggle and hard work and getting things wrong and making mistakes. And so when we see somebody lord knowledge over somebody else as though they know everything and have figured it out, and we're just complete morons for not knowing that, we kind of know that something's fishy,
Yeah. And in fact, I tell young people all the time that and I know you and I have talked about this, but the best the best way to grow in a career is the discipline of humiliation.
Yeah.
Not that you're seeking a way to be humiliated in everything.
Sure.
But that when you're wrong, you quickly go to the humiliation so that you can get to the answer.
Yep.
Because so many people, and I think that this just happened in our scientific and so-called scientific endeavors related to a virus. In fact, we're finding out the facts that happened now because everyone's finding out the problems with the mRNA vaccine, the virus itself, the treatments that should have been there. All this is coming out in the end, like you can't escape it in a sense. But people who do best are the ones who are most quickly in any endeavor, are most quickly capable of getting to a point of humiliation so that they can know what the wrong was, admit the wrong, and work to the answer. And I on a micro level, when we're trying to obtain some new knowledge about some area that we work in, that's required. But it's also required in the big picture, because sometimes we go down a path far enough that in the big picture, it's a massive failure and you got to draw back and get back on the right path.
Yep. That's right. I mean, just to go back to the book, just to what we've started talking about. So with Pax Romana, so my initial views on the Antonine Plague were that I'm not sure that this is a very big deal at all. And, you know, and I really listened to some people that had studied this a little bit more than I had, and I read some good books. And I didn't come to the view that this was, you know, a catastrophe in and of itself, but by being willing to kind of check my own priors and sort of say, okay, what does other evidence say? And then again, going through the COVID thing caused me to look beyond just the disease. Like I ended up, and that book, you know, got really well reviewed by people who are all over that debate. Like I had scholars that would vehemently disagree with aspects of what I wrote in that book. I'm praising the book. Like, as far as I know, I don't think the book received a single negative review, which is really rare. And that's not me bragging about how awesome I am, but it's just, I just sort of presented like, hey, here's the evidence that after really looking at it that I feel confident about. Here's the evidence that I don't feel confident about. And it was, it created, I think, an account of this disease that comes across as knowledgeable, but also humble at the same time. And that was because I was willing to admit that maybe my initial instincts on this disease were not right.
Well, and when you really get down to it, and I'm going to guess and verify this if I'm right about it, that this approach helped you figure out the size and scope and significance of it. You know, people think that economics is a study of how people spend money or how governments spend money.
Sure.
And it's really not. I mean, that's obviously an aspect of it. But really, when you consider the money being spent, you recognize that economics is the study of how it's a social science.
Correct.
That is a study of how human beings deal with scarce resources.
Yeah.
And that scarce resource, may be the money in your pocket, the things you own, but it's also my time, my priorities with people. I mean, that's all economics. And so am I right? And would I be right in my instinct of saying that the mass and scale and significance of that plague became more and more clear as you looked at stuff like that? Because it's kind of hard to find it always right in the written accounts.
Yeah.
Now you got to go look at, all the residual evidence of how government spent money, maybe some exchange between people that never made the historical record, but archaeologists have found, well, I've got this amount of barley wheat I was going to send to you, but I couldn't do it because blah, 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 or some accounting. I mean, am I getting that right?
So yeah. And this was sort of the surprise. One of the big surprises in writing the book was realizing that, okay, so this disease probably killed, and I don't put a percentage on it in the book, but it's going to be no more than 10%, I think, of the population of the Roman Empire. That's a lot, don't get me wrong, but I think probably less than that. I mean, I'd guess much closer to 5 or maybe even slightly less, but still a lot of people. But yeah, the bigger impact seems to be these the kind of social and economic ramifications. So if you have a disease outbreak in a mine, and it appears that we do have that in one of the major Roman silver mines called Alburnus Major in the Roman province of Dacia. So that mine just kind of shuts down in the middle of the Antonine Plague, probably in part because of disease, also in part because of war. But once that mine shuts down, it gets flooded, and it can't, like, it's very difficult to reopen it again. Same thing happens in other, like in quarries in the Roman Empire. Same, like, floods happen, and there's only so much that can be done. So you get those kinds of effects. Suddenly now you can't mint as much coins because you're not able to grab as much silver out of the mines, and so you get coin debasements. You get price inflation. I mean, they're just compounding effects, all because of a disease that doesn't kill a ton of people, but that causes enough disruption to kind of break down some of the systems in the Roman Empire.
And by the way, a little bit of perspective in military terms, if you go into battle and 10% of people die, that's considered a massacre for some unit.
Yeah.
Like it was unthinkable when you go to Gettysburg, for example, that Minnesota regiment that General Hancock sent down the hill at the middle of the line it didn't get decimated in the Roman sense of the word, which is every 10 people, when someone did something bad, they kill them. Like it got entirely wiped out. It's mind boggling when you think about that. And that doesn't happen too often. So, anyway, that I just wanted to give that sense about it.
Yeah.
Like in war, you really have less than 10% of soldiers die, and it's just who breaks first.
Yeah, I mean, disease is often the big killer in wars. That's the thing that Napoleon's army was just destroyed by, and in
Civil War too, disease. Both sides, yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
So we're thinking about the economics of this plague, and I'm trying to make sure we've got some good parallels to things that are happening today. What was the interaction with the government? What steps did Roman government take to deal with that situation? And in fact, what was the economic, in terms of government spending, what was the economic effect of the Roman government in reaction, in relationship to Roman citizens? And then how does that also play out for Christians at the time, and
sure,
the plague in general?
Yeah, there's a lot there. And so just stop me if I start
sure.
rambling, because there's so much in that. So as far as government response, so just in any crisis in the ancient world, the response of the government is pretty limited. It's going to be limited to things like some benefactions. So the government could, for example, pass out, cash or really more likely things like food, wine, and that sort of thing. Now, how often it did that is it seems to be pretty limited. If you've got a good emperor like Titus, so the emperor, good in the sense of distributing. So Titus was an emperor who reigned in the late 70s, early 80s AD. He was the son of the Emperor Vespasian, who was the conqueror of Jerusalem, the one who burned the Jewish temple. So Titus actually was the one that led that war. Anyway, Titus, there's a fire in Rome, there's a plague in Rome, and then you get Vesuvius. You get the volcanic eruption that buried Pompeii, which I'm sure some of the viewers and listeners would be familiar with. So when that happens, Titus just kind of out of his own pocket kind of helps. He it's not really, it's kind of a government program, but it's really kind of his personal,
it's kind of a political benefaction.
Yeah, it's like patronage. It's like he's the father of the country.
Right.
So it's kind of his job to help the children. So it's sort of different. It's like, we shouldn't really think of it as welfare. It's something kind of, it's like benefaction or gift giving or care or pastoral care, we might call it, but just at a grand scale. You have other emperors like Nero, who are atrocious though. Like there's the great fire in Rome under Nero that occurs in 64. AD. Okay, Nero does engage in some help, but mostly what he does is he appropriates the properties that were burned, and there was like a square mile of Rome that was burned right in the center of town, like prime real estate. He just expropriates that land, and he just decides, all right, I'm just going to build this giant palace on this land, with a huge statue of myself as a divinity, and we're going to put like a big private lake and gardens with peacocks and all. This is all for me. So, that's not much disaster relief on the part of Nero. During the Antonine Plague, there was really a lot of limitations as to what could be done. So in the city of Rome, there's a wave of this disease in 166. Marcus Aurelius is there in Rome, along with his co-emperor, a guy named Lucius Verus. It's easy to forget about him, but he was emperor as well for a period of time. So those two emperors decide to collect the corpses. So they pay for corpse removal. But the only other real kind of relief they can provide is they pass some laws that restrict who can be buried where, because people are just throwing corpses everywhere. They're throwing them in the ditches and the Tiber. They're stealing tombs that haven't been occupied yet. You can't have that, and so you get laws passed to kind of restrict burials. And then the last thing that Marcus does is he engages in like public mourning ceremonies. So holds kind of builds statues for the elite men that died in the plague, and then holds kind of mass remembrances for the many thousands of Romans that died. But there's really no prevention of the plague. Now, to the second part of your question, which kind of alluded to religion and Christians. So yeah, for Romans, really the only way to mitigate a plague, which is to them by definition an act of the gods. It's not germs. It's not science. It's the gods. So what needs to happen is, the gods that are responsible for diseases like Apollo and Artemis, maybe some underworld gods, those deities and forces need to be appeased. And so what we see is a slew of inscriptions coming up in cities saying, all right, we need to build a statue, and the statue needs to hold a bow and arrow. It needs to be pointed in this direction, and we need to do this to the walls. And there's even there's a guy in one part of Asia Minor who's like, yeah, you got to inscribe some words, and you could wear it, you put it on your house, or you wear it on an amulet. By the way, they found an amulet with these words in it all the way over in London, Rome and London.
Wow.
So that's how far these mitigation measures spread. But these are all religious, right? And of course they don't work. But what are you going to do when your religion, which is your whole worldview, is failing? And again, just to connect to the modern day, I think we saw this, right? We had this phrase in COVID, which was like mask harder, right? Wear 2 masks, wear 3 masks, that kind of thing. And that's in a way, kind of the way that we see ancient peoples responding to these moments where their religious mitigations fail. It's like, no, we just need to do this harder. So by the time we get to the Cyprianic plague, which is the plague after the Antonine Plague, you've got an emperor saying, we want everybody in the empire to sacrifice to the gods. They need to get a signed statement that verify, and we have some of these statements. They've survived for almost 2,000 years. These papyrus documents, which say like, I thus and such sacrificed in the presence of this official, and the official's called the prefect of sacrifices or the supervisor of sacrifice. Like there's like a guy that's like supposed to go and verify that everybody went and poured out offerings to the gods. And there's a whole statement that he signs, in order to verify this. And if you don't do this, this is a capital crime. So my point is, the way the Romans respond to these things is just harder and harder into this kind of these crazy religious mitigation measures that don't work. Meanwhile, the Christians are doing that. Again, the Christians are visiting the sick. They, in their congregations, they're providing burial services for the people that died. This is, of course, of great cost to the Christians. This is a sacrifice that they're making because, as the Bishop Cyprian in Carthage, whose the plague is named after, the Cyprianic plague, he even says this. That Christians would go and visit the sick, and then they would die after them. So I think that's in Eusebius, church historian. Anyway, the point is, Christians were engaging in self-sacrificial love during these pandemics and caring for their people. And for the Romans, it was like, suddenly we're just going to throw our bodies wherever. We're going to run away from the disease. We're going to scapegoat people. That was sort of the approach. And that there was a stark contrast between those two groups.
So are you saying then that in Roman culture, the concept of charity was almost entirely limited to what some politician would try to do to appease the people and keep them in support of him? Was there any kind of really cultural idea of what we think about as charity, helping the sick, someone's in a bad way and I want to help them out? I mean, I'm sure there was some human connection like that, but is it even very much like modern Western ideas of charity in any way, Roman culture?
Yeah, sometimes people will use words like welfare to describe things that happen in ancient Rome, and I would see that like that's to me is an anachronism. So when we look at and that word just means something that is not historic, like an idea that's not historically fit to a past time.
In other words, when we think of welfare, as we state that either from a government or charitable perspective, there was really no concepts like how we think about it today in Rome at the time, or very little.
Yeah. So let me frame what it kind of looks like as far as I know. So you have the kind of defining cultural idea in ancient Rome. This is patronage. So the idea is that elites, people that have wealth, do have a sense of obligation to the people that depend upon them, their family members, their slaves, and then kind of a broader community of people that might kind of voluntarily go into a relationship with them. But this is all voluntary. And a person a client of a patron could leave that patron at any time. But there's kind of a reciprocity there. So a patron is going to, he's educated, right? So he can provide financial advice. He can provide legal advice to his clients. And then the clients in turn will do things for the patron. Like they'll be his entourage. They'll vote for him. They will, if he dies or if his sister dies or something, they'll go to his funeral and mourn. So you do have a kind of reciprocity of patronage and client relationships in ancient Rome. But obviously that's very different than welfare. There's like kind of mutual obligations there. And then as far as like the state, that gets a little bit interesting too. And it touches on some things that you asked in your question. So as politicians realize that, well, as the Roman Republic frankly becomes more democratic, as the votes of the broader population increasingly matter and the aristocracy begins to lose its power, its kind of oligarchic power, you get these charismatic, what you might call demagogues, these populist politicians that realize that the path to obtaining votes is through people's stomachs. And if you can promise them reduced grain, for example, or eventually even free grain, then in the patron-client system, they owe you, right? It's like, you know, when we go to, I mean, sometimes actually this is true in the modern world, but in theory, our welfare programs are supposed to be bureaucratic and impersonal. Like we're not, like if you go and receive, I mean, I guess we don't like physically receive handouts anymore, but if you go to the food bank to get something from somebody, it's not like you owe that person that handed you the food. It's not like you have to now invite them over to your house for dinner. They're just an official, but in the Roman world, that's not the case. So these politicians kind of abuse the patron-client system and start passing out benefactions to people with the expectation that they're going to get those votes. And so you get a free grain program in Rome, but the whole point of it was not altruism or like helping the poor. The point of it was to aggrandize these politicians, to bring them benefits. And then when the emperor takes that over, it's really about the emperor showing that he's a father. It's like a way to kind of legitimize his authority. Again, it's not so much to help the poor. It's this is what an emperor does.
So if the patronage given did not come back with votes or some sort of political support or economic or political support coming back to them, did when these politicians had power, did they provide some sort of retribution against people who wouldn't actually support them when they were trying to gain their support?
You know, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think of of examples of that. I could think of something close, which is so the Emperor Julian, I believe this is who did this in the 4th century AD. So Julian is the last non-Christian emperor, and Julian is trying to fight a war against the Sassanid Persians in the east. That's kind of an old enemy of Rome.
Because he was based in Constantinople.
Yeah, and he moves over to Antioch actually to because that's the closest major city to fight that war. So he's in Antioch. So he moves from Constantinople to Antioch, and he's trying to deal with a food shortage there. He's trying to get food for his soldiers so that he can go and launch this campaign. And the citizens of Antioch are getting furious because the army is consuming all of their food. And Julian basically says, well, look, it's kind of the governor's fault. And he just kind of shifts blame over to the governor, and the population basically, kills this guy, just tortures him and kills him. So, that's an instance where, the people aren't providing anything back, but where you clearly see the kind of self-serving nature of these people in power. I don't think, in food riots in Rome where people aren't showing, I guess, proper gratitude, I guess, for all they've received, the emperors get very scared in those moments, right? The response is usually to find some emergency food just to pacify them or to get out of town. The Emperor Commodus does that. There's a plague and famine in Rome at the same time in the year 190 AD. And Commodus, who's a total coward, by the way, just decides to jet out of the city, just leaves the city to kind of riot. No sense of like trying to help people. So no, I mean, there's not, good emperors would be known for finding ways to help people. Claudius would do this at one point. His people in Rome at one point were starving over the winter, and in the Mediterranean, it's really hard to sail in the winter. The sea gets really choppy, and so Claudius takes a huge risk and sends some ships out to North Africa to get some grain, and it works out, and he's hailed as kind of a hero for doing this. But not every emperor is like that. So
what I think I'm hearing from you is that anything that we might define as welfare or government charity of any sort really is a political exchange. It really has very little to do with attempting to mitigate serious harm in the population for the benefit of the population. It's mostly, I mean, there might be some desire for the population or feeling bad for them under a certain circumstance, but there's nothing parallel in ancient Rome, at least, to what we consider right now as modern government charity, which ostensibly, even though I think I would argue it does it very poorly, and in fact, actually makes things worse, but the ostensible purpose for government charity in the modern West is to alleviate some problem. But in Roman culture, that was never quite the case. It was always a political or patronage style exchange. Yeah,
the patronage and the kind of politics of it are front and center. So, for example, when you get these laws mandating reduced price and then free grain, that goes to male citizens. it doesn't go to anybody in Rome, and that's on purpose, because the idea is you are better than a non-citizen if you receive an entitlement in this way. It's like a badge of belonging or honor. Like it's acknowledged that this is the produce that somebody else is having to create, and you are better because you are able to receive this, whereas other people are not. It's like a marker of citizenship. And so there are even a few times, like Julius Caesar does this, he purges the citizenship rolls of about 100,000 people for the express purpose of making that grain dole even more exclusive. And sort of because it's so tied to prestige and status, right? Totally different than modern charity, which, right, ostensibly, when we think, if we think of the welfare programs that we would want, if we imagined a welfare program working well, I think the way that we would describe it would be it's actually helping people who have a need. That would be, I think, what we would want to see. Like, we would want to see charity go to people who need it. We don't think of charity as like a way to create the kind of people who have status and the people who don't. Like, we don't want charity to put people down. We want charity to lift people up. And that's just not exactly the case with the way that this works in ancient Rome.
Is there any place in the ancient pagan world where such a, I mean, to the best of your knowledge, that such a motivation for a welfare program or a charitable program existed in that way, putting aside Christian influence? I'm just saying pagan influence. Is there any place that you're aware of?
Well, I mean, there are definitely ideas, ancient people, which I know, people, ancient peoples cared about their fellow man. Like there is a sense in which, again, especially when it comes to bonds of family, and household.
Yeah.
I think there are people that, like,
the
local
concept
elites.
of paterfamilias is one of that some people have heard of,
right?
And you could describe if you need to. Kind of falls into that.
So insofar, and again, I can't think of specific examples, but you would definitely have local elites that are heads of towns and villages and cities, and they're, of course, they're getting benefit, by appearing as patrons, but of course there would be people who cared and were motivated, and one example, here's an example I can think of is the Alimenta program. So this is a program that is started by the Emperor Nerva and is expanded by the Emperor Trajan. This happens in the late 90s AD, early 100s AD. And Trajan fights a war against the Dacians, which is a province which is now modern Romania, but this is a very rich province. There's gold and silver mines in this province. And Nerva and then Trajan set up this program where they're going to loan out money to Italian farmers out of this war spoils. And then when the farmers pay back that money, the interest that comes, it's 5% interest. That interest goes into a fund that then helps like poor and orphaned children in some parts of Italy. Now, again, so there is a sense in which that's going towards poorer people. However, there's mixed motives in there too, because Trajan is an emperor. I think he's the first emperor born outside of Italy. And part of the idea here is to say, look, I do care about Italy and I want to really help Italian children. I want to show that.
Where was Trajan born?
Trajan's born in Hispania, if I remember correctly.
So that, again, that's really far away from in ancient terms, very far away from Italy, and therefore suspect.
Yeah, he's the first. Now, at this point, Rome is the empire is kind of becoming more of a commonwealth, but there is still this sense that Rome, the city, and Italy is sort of prime, is sort of the pinnacle. And so it was a little weird for it's the first time that there's an emperor from outside of Rome. And so he does need to, that he's pro-Italy, right? That he's kind of he's assimilated in a way, and so that's also though what's going on. So and what we know of the Alimenta program, it doesn't help a lot of people. It's not like a mass charity program. I mean, it's helping probably like 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 of a very limited population of orphaned and very, very destitute children. But that's the closest I can think of where we see something like a kind of program that's designed in this way. But again, very limited and still has these mixed
and
motives
rather
in it.
unique, you'd say as well too. In terms
Yeah,
of,
very unique. I mean,
so it sounds to me like if I can try to summarize or to clarify what you're overall describing, is it safe to say then that certainly in ancient Roman pagan culture, but really in ancient culture, and you would obviously in your studies have connections into what Greek, the Greek period prior to Rome, would be, and so as you think about those, all the Mediterranean, I guess I should say, ancient pagan culture, there's not really any solid standard except in the unique circumstance under Trajan that you described. And there might be some other examples. We don't have to get into them, but it's very unique to find anything like the modern concept of what we do in the welfare state in the West. Right. Is that accurate?
Modern, like bureaucratized, welfare states, social systems, and all of that. This is not like this. Nothing even remotely like this would be present in any ancient society that I know of. I mean, even just the notion of bureaucracy is like, a very late development in the Roman Empire.
So if we're trying to think as modern people, trying to grapple with, as we do, what government does, there's hardly any, if any lessons we can learn in terms of the modern welfare state. Social security systems, direct welfare payments, medical welfare systems like Medicare, Medicaid, and whatever is similar in Europe or elsewhere. There's really nothing in ancient culture, and ancient people would never have thought through the same issues that we're thinking through when we consider that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there's like so much sort of just intellectual development that's happened, like even just the idea of nations and all that. Like this is all so recent. I mean, there are things that are timeless, like there are economics of handouts and things that we could look at and we could draw some comparisons with. And certainly like there are moments when emperors or local officials will engage in things like price controls to try to so like with the grain subsidy, for example, this is not comparable to a modern like food stamp program, but the economics could be comparable in the sense that, unsurprisingly, if you subsidize the price of grain, if the state of Rome is passing out grain at a huge discount that many people can get, that's going to have huge effects on the private market for grain, right? That's going to have some really detrimental effects.
But that also seems somewhat haphazard, not particularly organized.
No.
Based on what's going on at the moment. And there might have been some mild charitable consideration, but more importantly, there probably was a political one.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again,
yes.
This correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems entirely different than anything we do in the modern West. Yeah. And Asian countries have Western influence and do, but it's not even really a parallel at all to ancient culture. I'm not trying to force that.
No, I see your point. Yeah, no, but the point, like anyone who would try to say there's this long legacy of welfare or something like that, and we see it in the ancient world and it's real similar, I think that's just not the case.
Well, so there's a reason I'm asking you this. I mean, my motive is going to be very clear here. So therefore, Christians come on the scene after the resurrection of Christ. And this church is beginning to expand, mostly in the Mediterranean, during the first 100 years of Christian, the history of the Christian church, 100 years or so, and you've got the biblical text in the New Testament when it discusses welfare, charity, the helping of others. This would have been a radical, philosophically, theologically, culturally, in every way, a radical departure from anything anyone had seen in ancient pagan culture. Is that accurate as well too?
There are definitely some aspects that are very different. So let me say something that's the same and something that's different. So in the city of Rome, you did have some like working man's groups. Like you had groups of people that were all construction workers or like all they were like in a common, they were dock workers or something.
Trades groups,
yeah.
Tradesmen groups.
And those people would have like a membership and they might do some basic things for each other as kind of like a mutual aid society or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's the closest comparator. But obviously Christianity and initially the Romans are kind of like, is that what Christians are? Because they're kind of doing some of those things. So what Christians are doing though is really very different. So Christians would meet, every Sunday or a Saturday night in some cases in the earliest days of the church. They would take up a collection and then they would distribute. They would distribute food. They would distribute money. They would have a meal together. They would distribute to widows and orphans. They would help the elderly. They would visit prisoners. So they would do a lot more than these working man groups would do, but they were very focused on their members. And of course there was a different motivation because this was not an economic transactions. What the Christians were doing was agape. They have this word for it, which is self-sacrificial love. That's what agape is. And so the idea is we are giving even if we do not receive a return. So even like in the patron-client relationship, there's a return. In the working man's associations, there's a return. For the emperor and his people, there's a sense of return. For Christians, that is not the case. They are serving each other and modeling Christ, right? Who gave abundantly out of his righteousness for sinners who were not just indifferent to him, but were enemies of him. And so Christian charity has that at its ethos from the very beginning. It has this radical idea of giving without the expectation of return.
It sounds like this would have seemed really, really weird to ancient culture outside of the church. Like it was such a radical difference that the people would have seemed odd, that there might have been people looking down upon this effort. And so if that's the case, I mean, well, verify that, one, and two, give me some examples of what people said about that from pagan perspective. Great.
Yeah. So Christians, I mean, were thought to be, essentially mentally ill for doing this. So you have, that's one reaction. I mean, the other reaction has to do with kind of the way that they do things. So Christians would meet. So they're not engaging in like the public religion. So Roman religion is very outdoors. It's all the, anytime a vote is taken there's just constantly sacrifices and rituals and incense burning, and it's all happening outdoors. Whereas the Christians are meeting together. They're taking up that collection. Like, you can't get into a church. I mean, this is something very different even with modern churches. I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm glad that modern churches are pretty invitational, but early churches, you kind of and part of this is because of persecution. They had to kind of vet people before you were allowed to even kind of come in to the gathering of people, which wasn't in a church, it was in a home. But the point is, all this seemed very secretive to the Romans. And so for them, these Christians are gathering together and they're sharing a meal, and they even claim that they're remembering the body and blood of Jesus, a criminal, and they're eating it. That sounds
a crucified criminal, by the way.
Right. That's right. That sounds like cannibalism. They are greeting one another with a kiss, and yet they're calling each other brother and sister. This sounds like incest. So for the Romans, the secretive nature, or their perceptions about the secretive nature of Christianity caused them to think that what Christians were doing must be something very nefarious, at least at first.
Are there any major historians or otherwise who talk about this and the oddities of it, or what were their perspectives on it?
Yeah. So there are many. I couldn't think of names right now. I mean, there's a great historian. He's kind of an anthropologist, sociologist named Starks, who I find his book very persuasive on the early church. You got other historians like Keith Hopkins, or
what about contemporary historians? I'm trying to get at what contemporary historians were saying at the time.
Yeah. So, you mean at the time? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't have a lot because, so many of the arguments against Christianity just didn't survive. We do have them embedded in some Christian defenses of Christianity. So like there was a guy named Octavius was his name, or maybe that's the name of the work. There's a work from the 2nd century where essentially what I told you is what this kind of anti-Christian author is saying. He's just sort of saying, look, they meet in secret. They're engaging in all sorts of strange rituals. There's that. Another example of maybe a contemporary is Julian. So the Emperor Julian, who I mentioned is the last non-Christian emperor, he's pretty upset because Christians are caring for the population, some of the population in Antioch, and they're very, the population's upset at him. And he writes a letter at one point saying like, he's really upset with the Christians because they're kind of undermining him because he's not able to care for anybody, or he won't. And yet the Christians are kind of helping people. And this is sort of undermining him. So you get those kind of reactions as well.
I'm putting my head around these things when I think about it, but also in what you're saying. And when I bring this into contemporary culture and the debates that we're having over welfare and that sort of thing in this day and age. And I hear a mostly progressive Christian idealism that says that we're supposed to utilize government means to get to charitable outcomes. And I argue that, frankly, right now there's a monopoly on charity in the government. And I don't see the early church as really concerning itself with such things. Quite to the contrary, that it wouldn't have been even thought of because it couldn't have been encouraged. But also, I don't think that they would have wanted it anyway because of the exclusive nature of the charity that they were doing and the limited nature of government charity at the time, which was always about patronage. When I hear Christians these days trying to put together some concept that when Paul is talking about charity, when there's any discussion of taking care of the poor, I just don't see any relationship to what's going on today. I mean, do you see any connection? Like, is there some way to take the admonitions to act in a charitable manner in the New Testament? Is there any way to compare that to the discussions that we hear about that today, particularly which call on us to make sure that we allow government programs to continue, for example? Is there just any way to make a connection to that from an historical perspective, as far as you can tell?
Yeah. So here's one just major difference between ancient Christian charity and modern welfare. Voluntary, right? That word voluntary. Christian charity was always a at least before, in the early church, is a collection, voluntary collection. People gave as they were able to give. It was redistributed through the church officials, and it was on the basis of true, genuine need. And even then, if we look at, even some of the earliest Christian texts in Scripture, we see comments that go with charity about people need to be able to take care of their own. Like you should not impoverish yourself so that you need charity and yet not take care of your own household, like not caring for your own, like Paul even says, not caring for your own household is essentially like being an unbeliever. So all that's just to say a modern welfare program is not voluntary, right? What happens in a modern welfare program is money is extracted from somebody without their consent. And then it is given to somebody who that person may or may not wish to help. And again, there's like a rinse cycle there. It goes through a kind of a bureaucracy and an administration, all that. Whereas Christian charity was very direct. I mean, we're talking about people that knew each other, that knew the needs of, of different families that were nearby. And the point was to put people back into a position where they were able to care for their own, right? And charity, the people that were like regular recipients of charity were the people that really had no family. They were orphans or they were widows. They did not have the care structure that existed. So there's just such a huge difference between a kind of impersonal, bureaucratized, involuntary welfare program and early Christian charity. Just the differences are stark.
Well, so some people would argue, though, and I've heard them argue, they've tried to challenge me on this, and I agree with what you just said, but they've challenged me to say, well, no, actually, it's voluntary to the extent that you vote for your representatives in this republic. And so therefore, in that sense, it's not quite as involuntary as you would say. So therefore, you should support these government programs. What are your thoughts on that? And I have I want to also think about charity more broadly in the ancient culture. But what are your thoughts about someone that makes that statement?
Yeah. So this is really getting into my personal opinion, but Christianity is concerned not just with the ends of something, but also the means. We should do right things, but we should do right things the right way. So we should not break commandments in order to fulfill other commandments. And, if I knew that my elderly neighbor next to me was in need, it would be wrong for me to go to another one of my neighbors, rob them of their money, and go and give it to my elderly neighbor that was in need. I would be doing good for one neighbor, but I would be violating the basic commandment not to steal in doing that. So when Christians engage in charity, it's important that we support charity efforts that are biblical. So I'm all for charity. I participate in charity. I've received charity in various ways. When I first moved to England with my wife, we had nothing. The exchange rate got really bad really quick. We didn't have any family in the country that could help us. We just had some desperate need for both housing, and for our housing fell through. There's a variety of things that happened to us. And the church there didn't know us, that we had gone to church one time on one Sunday. They're giving us furniture out of their house, like not just giving us some money, like literally, like they collected some spare bits of furniture, like a end table and a sofa and stuff that came, like their living room didn't have a sofa for a period of time, so that my wife and I could have a sofa. And just have somewhere where we could lay down for a little bit. And the pastor of that church let us stay in a room in his house for a period of time. Like that cost him. So my point is, like, there's this real connection in Christian charity between sacrifice, the expectation of not receiving, and then not breaking commandments, right? Fulfilling the charity in a way that's morally consistent. And modern welfare just fails on so many of those accounts, right? If we think about how is the money obtained, especially for a federal program, how is the money obtained to provide that charity? It's often printed out of thin air. It's not only taken, it's taken from future generations. I mean, think about the immorality of making sure that older people that have worked their whole lives, that could have provided for themselves, they need to be paid. They need to have money taken from some future children who maybe aren't even born yet, so that through inflation, through money printing. I mean, that to me, I just don't see a connection between that and Christian charity.
Well, when you look back at ancient Christian charity, which was a radical innovation, you spoke to part of the exclusivity of charity, even in the modern church, that is focused as a primary consideration on those in need within the body of believers. But if you go to the Antonine Plague, they started to, and in other iterations, not just the plague, but they started casting this out further into society on a very purposeful way.
So Christians, and we don't have a direct, well, we do. We have Eusebius talks about the way he's a church historian that wrote in the early to mid 300s AD. Eusebius writes an account of the Cyprianic plague, so the plague after the Antonine Plague, and he does indicate that people noticed that Christians were willing to sacrifice, because the Romans, many inhabitants of the Roman world, claimed, like they sort of signaled, hey, yeah, we care about burials. We care, like we're a moral, civilized society. And then when these plagues hit, like order just breaks down, except among the Christians. The Christians would go and bury the sick, care for the sick, and then bury the dead, even though it cost them. And this was a form of witness. This was by that I mean it was a form of verification. The Christians did this, even though it cost them, because it helped to prove that what they were saying was true, that they really believed that they were going to be resurrected again. And so in a sense, they could serve in a radical way. And that's, I think, again, another challenge when we look at things like welfare. It's like, if it's welfare without a cost, or just the cost is borne by some unknown, unnamed future person or abstract person, to what extent are we getting a moral benefit from it, right? And Christian charity, again, is interested not just in the benefits to the person that receives, but the kind of character improvement, that the sanctification, use a Christian term, the sanctification that comes from the act of sacrificing to give as well. All right. We would say as Christians, it's not like God needs our money. He's God, but God improves the character of his people by means of their giving and their acts of sacrifice. So we're not giving to churches and to missions organizations and to charity organizations because God hasn't figured out how to get money. We give to those organizations to help, but also because we receive a blessing. We grow as people. We become more like Christ, because that's what Christ did for us. Christ gave of himself for his people. And so Christians are called to do the same thing.
And in the ancient world, when they were like you read of Justin Martyr, the famous church apologist, and others, other ancient writers, Tertullian, and they're really describing when charity goes out into the pagan culture around them, a very purposeful desire, not just to show charity out of kindness. And by the way, they were limited. They couldn't spread charity to every person to meet every need. But there was a real intent to share the gospel, which I think even Roman culture would push back on from time to time and say, you're crossing a line here. I mean, is that right? Or do I understand that correctly?
So yeah, Tertullian, so he talks about this in his Apology, which is not, by the way, Tertullian saying he's sorry. Apology means a defense. So Socrates, Plato also wrote an apology of Socrates. It just means
Justin Martyr called his book an apology.
That's right.
Too,
exactly right. Mm-hmm. So it's a defense, and so in one section of that defense, Tertullian, who for folks that don't know, Tertullian is convert to Christianity. He lives in North Africa, so in the city of Carthage. He's born around the time of the Antonine Plague. He's probably born around 160, 165. He seems to have like a legal mind based on the way that he writes, but he becomes a Christian. He's an elite Roman, a citizen that becomes a Christian. And so Tertullian has this unique view where he understands Roman culture and he understands Roman religion, and he also understands what's going on in the church, and he's convinced by it. And so he lays out in his apology, in a section of it, a little bit about what you're saying, Jim. It's like, Christians give voluntarily. We don't give because we're forced to. So he highlights that difference.
He says that specifically or in some manner.
Yes, I think it's 39. I think it's book section 39 of the apology. Someone could look it up, but I think that's where it is. He emphasizes the role of that this is going within the church, and then that is the witness. So to go back to what you're saying about kind of the gospel, the witness is what Christians are not, or what Tertullian is not advocating, is that Christians just give out money or goods to anybody. What Tertullian is saying is, look at how we care for our family. Look at what our faith makes us do for our own household. Don't you want to be a part of our household? Can't you see that, Romans, can't you see that what we're doing is a good thing? I think even at one point in that same section, he uses the word parasites to describe the contrast. He calls kind of the Roman way of doing things parasitical, which is kind of ironic if we think about, the differences between Christian charity and other forms of charity, right? Because if you look at charity, a model of charity or welfare, which is extractive, where you're taxing people, so you're taking from them involuntarily, you're taking money from them that they might use in better ways. You're then losing a bunch of that money in the administration, corruption, graft, all of that happens. And then you're paying out a fraction of that money to people who may or may not actually need it, and in ways which may make them continually dependent on that money. In other words, at every stage of that model, there's arguably harm being done, if any real benefit. And I'm not trying to say that a family that desperately needs food stamps isn't benefited the moment that they get those food stamps. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying that if we look at the system, if we zoom out on the system of the model of charity, to me, the Christian model makes a lot more sense compared to the modern model. I pulled up section
39. I'm going to read something here real quick.
Yeah, sure. To see. Did I get it right? So, is he talking about charity there?
He is.
All right.
Let me just read this. Some of this, I haven't read this whole section I'm going to read, but it all looks relevant. So let me read this. So there is, and I'm only reading part of section 39, which when you read a lot of these ancient books, like they're 1 or 2 paragraphs long, the sections. So it's not like a whole typical way we do it today. But anyway, here's this. There's no buying and selling of any sort in the things of God. Though we have our treasure chest, it is not made up of purchase money, as of a religion that has its price. On the monthly day, if he likes, each puts in a small donation, but only if it be his pleasure, and only if he be able. For there is no compulsion, all is voluntary. These gifts are, as it were, piety's deposit fund, for they are not taken thence and spent on feasts, on drinking bouts, on eating houses, but to support and bury poor people, to supply the wants of boys and girls destitute of means and parents, and of old persons confined now to the house, such too as have suffered shipwreck. And if there happen to be any in the mines, or banished to the islands, or shut up in the prisons for nothing but their fidelity to the cause of God's church, they become nurslings of their confession. But it is mainly the deeds of a love so noble that lead many to put a brand upon us. I mean, there's much more there. Probably could read the whole thing.
Yeah.
So there is no, in ancient culture, there really is no sense at all. I take it this way. There's no sense at all of real, I mean, there's some, you pointed out some mild similarities, but you kind of have to strain a lot to make a connection between how we do welfare and charity through the government bureaucratically in this day and age, and anything that happened in ancient culture, and that the church brought in a much different way of thinking about this that began with the need to help their own community who were being persecuted or who found themselves in a life situation of need, and like in after the sack of Rome that Augustine pointed to in City of God, or the Antonine Plague, they would come up to meet the need of the moment when it got bad enough, and almost always for the purpose of spreading God's love as opposed to institutionalizing anything, just to meet a need. I think I'm summarizing that correctly based upon what ancient culture, how they would have perceived it and how Christians even perceived it.
So, yeah, I mean, even the language that then that quotation there, I think you mentioned something about, Tertullian said something about the people that were receiving becoming nurslings. I don't remember if he said in the faith.
Yeah, nurslings, yeah.
So the idea there, right, is the point of the charity is, yes, it alleviates a material need, but the point is ultimately to spread the faith, right? The charity is a way to grow people spiritually and to prepare them for eternity. And for a person that's kind of a purely kind of, as a non-religious or a person, that maybe doesn't make any sense, because why wouldn't you alleviate just people's material need? But we see the model of that approach, right? It's communism. That's kind of the ultimate form of secular charity, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And I'm sorry, it doesn't work. Wouldn't it be great if there was a model where you could do charity without sacrifice and without expropriation and all of that? But it just breaks down. It just does. And I have to say, Christian charity has shown itself to be very effective. I'm not saying that there aren't bad actors in Christian organizations. I'm not saying there haven't been mishandled resources or whatever, but I mean, the whole reason we have hospitals, that the hospitals come out of Christian charity. So I mean, to me, the difference is very clear, which obviously you're pointing out really, really effectively. The difference is clear, but the effectiveness is also clear. It's not just that Christian charity, early Christian charity, and the alternative were very different. They were different in terms of their outcomes and their success. I mean, the Annona program in Rome, for example, fails spectacularly eventually. And yes, it's amazing in the sense, like, it's amazing economies of scale to like figure out how to move this grain from Egypt and North Africa and so on into the city of Rome, like that, and expropriate it, and to, force people to do that. Like that, there's certainly there's an impressive sense of order there and state power. But in terms of sustainability, the Roman Empire isn't here anymore. The Annona program isn't here anymore. Christian charity continues to thrive. The church continues to thrive. And I think that is a pretty clear sign as to which model makes sense and which model is. And really, wanting.
In many ways, that particular program was never perpetuated in too much similar form for centuries thereafter. There probably, by the time you get to Charlemagne, was a little bit more sense of what you might try to do through government to help people in a non-pagan manner and for more charitable purposes. But again, never anything organized until the modern era of any significance, I would say. And it's one of the things. And I know I want to be respectful of your time here, but one of the things that I think about a lot is the fact that there's deep criticism of Donald Trump wanting to cut out USAID funding that helps people in Africa, much of which goes to HIV prevention, which, frankly, in my opinion, is perpetuating a open sexual lifestyle and protections toward that lifestyle, which I don't see, frankly, as a charitable need at all. I think people need to make decisions about their lives. But even when it comes to some food programs and stuff like that over in Africa, I mean, there just is not the modern thought of this does not have an ancient parallel. And that's important to me because there's this appeal to Christian doctrine and teaching related to the poor, that all of which developed in the ancient world, all of which was responsive to what was happening in the ancient world, and none of which was responsive to things that are happening today. I mean, I think that, frankly, we need less government interaction in welfare of any sort, And we need more charitable action happening from the culture itself. Hopefully Christian motivated, but motivated of whatever sort. Because government really does never do things well enough to perpetuate themselves. And often that ancient program you're talking about was probably more effective than modern charitable things that happen through the government, which are bureaucratized and waste a lot of money, it seems. I don't know. That's what I think about when I think about this. Am I getting this right, maybe in terms of this ancient to modern perspective, or is there something I'm missing maybe?
There's a lot there. So I think just to touch on what you were saying, and again, this is kind of this is less my view as a historian and more just my view as a person, but often helping in the kind of, and I've kind of said this already, in this kind of bureaucratic, you could look at USAID or other foreign aid, for example, it often hurts, right? There have been numerous studies that show, if you flood, for example, a developing country with goods or money coming from outside, it tends to undermine the local economy's ability to produce for itself at kind of the place where it is. And, this is just, what's hard is we as people, and this is very good, this is wonderful about we as people, we see people hurting and we want to help. I think the overwhelming majority of people are like that. I'm like that. You're like that, Jim. Most people are like that. And as Tom Holland has well documented, I mean, a lot of that in Western culture is because of the deep influence of Christianity in the West. So yeah, we have a human connection to people. We have the ability to empathize. We see a human being hurting. It's easy for us to understand what that must be like. And so and if we're in a position to help, we want to help. Now that works really well in a family, in a neighborhood, for example. It can work well in a town, maybe. But the more abstract it becomes, the larger it becomes, the more distant it becomes, the more difficult it is, right? The sacrifice, for example, that goes along with helping a family member or a neighbor physically, like you yourself having to do something to help that person. It just helps give that act of charity not just a sense of moral purpose, but it kind of it builds in a kind of an economics to it that helps you understand the value of it. Like the neighbor experiences you helping them, it helps them realize the value. It's like less of an entitlement, and it's more of just a thing of beauty that happens when people help each other in a local setting. But when we're talking about sending huge amounts of tax money, for example, maybe for a good purpose, at least motivated well. We see people in a country in another part of the world and we're thinking, man, we'd love to help those people that have got a disease or something like that. But it's not the same as helping a neighbor. It's just the mechanism isn't. So all of the motives in the world, all of the wonderful motivations of collecting that money here, creating an administrative apparatus and then sending it, even if it worked well, it would just not perform the same level of good as some way of enabling those local people to kind of care for in a sustainable way their own issue. I mean, you could see this in non-governmental charity too. I mean, you have numerous like church organizations even that would do mission trips, or that would go to a South American country, for example, or a village, and just give out stuff. Meanwhile, the business owners in that town are ruining that church organization, because for a week or 2 weeks or for a month, they're wrecking their business because suddenly everybody can get this stuff for free. So my point just is that charity has to be done reflectively. Like and the early church had a whole model, right, through the example of Christ, through the scriptures of how to do it. Like motives were not enough, but there was an entire sort of system of thinking about it that was integrated with their faith that Roman patronage and grain subsidies and all of that just did not have, and which modern welfare also simply doesn't have. Despite the power of the scale of something like foreign aid, it also compounds the corruption and the various problems as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we close down, we spent a lot of time talking about ancient society as it comes to this. You actually have a podcast where you talk about these issues quite a bit. I think you mostly are given the history, but the times that I've listened, you are making some modern connections. Tell people what your podcast is and what you're doing there.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So my podcast is called the Pax Romana Podcast, Pax Romana Podcast. And basically what I do is I'm giving everybody sort of a free history lesson. So in short segments, 15 to 20 minute segments, we start with the death of Julius Caesar and we just start going, telling the story of the Roman Emperor. We look at emperors, we look at senators, we look at different cities. We just are just sort of going through the kind of long history of the Roman Empire. We get to the church. Right now, we've got Constantine the Great is who we're looking at, who is the first Christian emperor. So it's I designed the podcast to be pretty digestible for people that don't know a lot about Roman history and they want to learn something about it. It kind of functions as like an audiobook, but it's not, it's me. And if you see the way that Jim and I are talking on the podcast, it's sort of in this style. And yeah, you're right, Jim. Occasionally like a modern parallel or example will come up. So for example, I did an episode recently on a period when a Roman emperor tried to control all of the prices and wages in the Roman Empire. And so we make some modern comparisons when attempts like this have been made in the present, with unsurprisingly dismal results. So that's the Pax Romana podcast. If people are interested, they can find it anywhere podcasts are available.
Yeah. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any podcast app that you have.
Yeah. Check it out.
You have a website?
I don't. I probably should.
Need to work with you.
I'm a typical professor who totally doesn't know how to do any kind of marketing or anything like that. I'm fortunate that I have some friends that have podcasts that will, invite me on to chat a little bit. But otherwise, I write books and I podcast, and then I teach at the university, which it's a great job.
And like I say, Colin is just one of my closest friends. He's a professor, PhD professor in classics, the classics department at Indiana University. And I happen to have my home. I'm here in Bloomington actually right now, typically in DC, but here we are not doing it face to face. Kind of funny, but
it's funny. We're probably just recently. A few miles apart.
Yeah, absolutely. But not bad at all. But you had an injury recently, so
that's true.
That's true. But anyway, thanks for taking some time on the Conservative Caucus podcast. I do want to encourage everyone to check out your Pax Romana podcast, Pax Romana podcast. The Pax Romana is the book you wrote, which is a play on words for the virus. Pax meaning virus in Latin.
The Pax Romana is, so your viewers understand this, the Pax Romana is the Roman peace. This is the period of prosperity, and that's what the podcast is named after, the Pax Romana. But then you get this plague at the very end of the Pax Romana, and so the publisher was like, we should call this book Pax Romana, like pox. Yeah. Genius idea. I'm sure that, 1,000 or more of the book sales are just due to that clever title.
And it's not a twist on words. It's an actual word.
Yeah.
Pox really does have a Latin root for meaning a virus or a plague or whatever. Yeah. So, and so people should go to Amazon or elsewhere to get your book.
The paperback edition just came out. So if they want that edition, they can get it. It's Kindle. There's an audio book as well.
You told me to buy the book sometime back, so I had to pay for the hardback. I actually, so I've read the book. I think everyone should read it because it actually is quite approachable. You're a serious historian, obviously, and there's some technical or slightly technical in there, but it's really very, very approachable for people. And I find it it an interesting story. And I think people will derive the parallels themselves.
Yeah.
Because you do bring some of them up, but not in some ultimate direct way.
Yeah.
It's really just a great history of how that played out. And I think people are going to draw a lot of lessons about what just took place some years ago recently with the COVID vaccine. That'll be useful for perspective, I think.
I'll take that as a compliment, Jim, because I didn't want to, people are pretty tired of professors hammering their views onto others. And so that is exactly what I tried to do in the book, was just present the facts and let people determine, and let people kind of make their own decisions. That's the way I run my classroom. I think that's really the best way to do things. And it's kind of worked out for me in that way. I'm sure that there are folks that wish I took this side or that side on thus and such thing, but I really believe in presenting the facts. I think that's my job as a historian, and to kind of compose a narrative that really makes sense to people. And that's what I'm trying to do with the podcast and the books that I write.
Well, and we lack critical thinking skills in this modern culture. I mean, it's a more severe problem than ever. It was always a bit of a problem in the last 80 or so years in the West, but it's gotten to a critical mass right now. And the only way through that is presentation of facts. The challenge, actually, and I try to do this even in my political work, the challenge is, that we should put on others is challenging them to make a case for their point and to oppose it, not merely because there is a difference, but to oppose it in a manner that requires a verification of truth.
Yeah.
And there's been an eschewing of truth in this modern culture, and we need to press for truth more purposefully. And you can only do that with a more open discussion and a willingness to recognize you might be partly wrong on the edges, or maybe even completely wrong.
Yeah, I'm part of a group. It's a small group right now at Indiana University, and there are people in this group from all over the political spectrum. We've got Marxists, we've got conservatives, we've got Democrats, Republicans, libertarians, all sorts of folks. And it's a group that is really interested in open ideas, viewpoint diversity at the university. And to your point, every single syllabus that I put out for my courses, right in that syllabus is no idea is above scrutiny. Like every idea has should be challenged, through reason and good evidence. So I think that's what universities should do, and that's where they're at their best. And certainly that's kind of my approach to everything that I do as an intellectual.
Yeah, that's great. Well, everyone needs to look for your Pax Romana podcast. I think they're going to find it very informative. It's very approachable, and a lot of people should learn a lot more about Roman history, ancient history. There's a lot of good stuff there. And then your Pax Romana book on Amazon, and I think everyone should read it. But Colin, first of all, we're personal friends, so it's always fun to do this on that basis. Secondly, I do greatly respect your expertise in these areas, and I learn a lot from you, and because I do have a passion for the subject matter as it is anyway, but it's always great to have that. And I just appreciate you taking some time being on the Conservative Caucus podcast.
Absolutely, Jim. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us today on the Conservative Caucus podcast with my friend Colin Elliott. I know that you got a lot out of this discussion, and what I hope you walk away with is the fact that for those of us in the conservative movement who want to see a change in how government runs, you're not violating a Christian principle, really any rational principle, by working to get these welfare programs, these ways that government takes our money and uses it for charity. You're going to find that you're not wrong in wanting to see those things change. I think it's a critical time in our history in the United States that we radically transform our ideas on this topic and how we approach this. In fact, you're seeing a great example down in Argentina with Javier Milei, who became president of Argentina, radically transforming all the programs that were in his government. And they're seeing great economic success. They're seeing poverty reduced, greatly. We could do these same things, and whatever negative effect people claim they would have, mostly Democrats, some Republicans, it's just a wildly fantastical and wrong idea. We can pull these things back. So I hope you got a lot out of that today. Again, make sure you go to theconservativecaucus.com, find out more about our organization, share and like this podcast on every platform where you're seeing it, and then share it with your friends as well. And send us your ideas of, as we're developing this podcast, of things you'd like to see us do, guests you'd like me to interview and talk to. I really am connected to a lot of people. I want to get to the ones that most interest you and help you get a great benefit from this podcast. Again, like and subscribe. Email us at info@theconservativecaucus.com with your ideas, with your feedback. We want to hear from you. Find out what you like, what you'd like us to do. Again, email us at info@theconservativecaucus.com, and we'll definitely read every one of them and do the best we can to respond. So thank you for your time today. Follow us on social media. We're on X, we're on Facebook, we're on True Social, we're on every major platform, YouTube, Rumble. Follow us at all these places. Give us feedback, comment, and like and reply. And thank you for joining us today on the Conservative Caucus podcast.